Margaret Castellano stood at the door of a cabin she abandoned 40 years ago. The key still fit. What waited inside would shatter everything she believed about the life she left behind. Margaret Castellano's hands trembled as she turned the corroded key in the lock. 40 years. For decades since she'd walked away from this cabin nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, leaving behind everything she couldn't bear to face. The door resisted at first, wood swollen from years of rain and mountain mist, then surrendered with a groan that echoed through the silent forest like a wounded animal crying out. She had expected devastation. Expected the rot of neglect, collapsed walls, the acrid smell of decay consuming wood and memory alike. Instead, the air that escaped through the opening carried something entirely different, lavender and cedar, achingly familiar and utterly impossible. Like someone had been living here recently. Like someone had been keeping watch, waiting. Margaret was 71 now, her once dark hair gone silver, her body shaped by years spent teaching literature at a university in Boston, thousands of miles from these mountains, countless miles from the past she tried so desperately to outrun. She had returned for one singular reason: Clackamas County was liquidating the property for 4 decades of unpaid taxes. She had 72 hours to salvage anything worth preserving before the demolition crews arrived. 3 days to confront what she'd spent 40 years fleeing. Her son, Daniel, had insisted on accompanying her. "Mom, you shouldn't face this alone," he'd said at the Portland airport, his eyes filled with concern she felt she hadn't earned. But she declined firmly. Some specters demanded to be confronted in solitude, without witnesses to your unraveling. She stepped across the threshold. The cabin was modest, just 2 rooms with a sleeping loft above, but it had been her entire universe once. The main room contained a cast-iron stove, a handmade pine table, 2 mismatched chairs. Afternoon sunlight pierced gaps in the shutters, painting golden bars across the floorboards. And those floorboards, they were immaculate. Not merely aged wood clean, but freshly swept. Recently maintained. Margaret's chest constricted. Squatters, perhaps. Or locals using the abandoned structure for storage. Yet the door had been secured. The windows intact. And nothing appeared disturbed or pilfered. On the table rested a teacup. Margaret approached slowly, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. The cup was delicate porcelain, the kind they'd owned here 40 years ago, hand-painted with tiny blue forget-me-nots. She lifted it with shaking fingers, rotated it slowly. On the bottom, in faded permanent marker, were initials, V.C. Vivian Castellano. Her wife. The cup slipped from her grasp and struck the floor without shattering, rolling in a lazy semicircle before coming to rest against a table leg. Margaret stared at it, her breathing shallow and rapid. Vivian had been gone for 42 years. Dead and buried in Riverside Cemetery in the valley below. Margaret had fled 2 years after the funeral, incapable of inhabiting a space where Vivian's absence screamed from every corner, every empty chair, every silent morning. So why was Vivian's teacup sitting on this table as though she'd just finished her afternoon Earl Grey? She retreated several steps, her mind fragmenting. This defied reason. Someone was orchestrating a vicious joke. Had to be. But who? Who even knew about her return? Her gaze swept the room again, searching for additional anomalies. The stove gleamed, ashes meticulously removed. The windows, though shuttered, had been recently wiped, no thick accumulation of grime, merely a whisper-thin layer of dust. On the western wall hung a calendar. Margaret walked toward it, her legs unsteady. The calendar was from 1985. The year she'd abandoned everything. But it was open to October. And today's date, October 11th, bore a small pencil mark in the corner box. A single X. Margaret felt ice flood her veins. She pivoted toward the bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. She had deliberately avoided looking at it until this moment. That room contained too much: the bed where Vivian had taken her last breath, the rocking chair where Margaret had sat holding her hand through that endless final night, the window where she'd watched dawn break and understood that Vivian was truly gone. She forced herself forward. The bedroom was dim, shutters sealed tight against the light. But when she pushed the door fully open, enough illumination spilled from the main room to reveal the impossible. The bed was made. Not just casually arranged, but meticulously prepared, the patchwork quilt pulled taut and tucked with military precision, pillows positioned exactly as Vivian used to arrange them, one slightly higher than the other because of Margaret's neck problems. And on the nightstand sat a glass of water, perfectly clear, not clouded with time's passage. And on the pillow, Vivian's pillow, lay an envelope. Margaret's knees buckled. She grabbed the doorframe, steadying herself against the sudden vertigo, her heart hammering so violently she thought her ribs might crack. She couldn't move. Couldn't draw breath. Couldn't reconcile what her eyes were reporting. The envelope was unsealed, her name written across the front in handwriting she would have recognized in total darkness, in another lifetime, in her dreams. Margaret. Vivian's handwriting. Unmistakable. The distinctive way she formed the capital M with that elegant flourish. The slight forward lean of every letter, like they were all rushing towards something urgent. She stood paralyzed for what might have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning. Then, moving as though submerged in honey, she crossed to the bed and retrieved the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, folded once. She unfolded it with agonizing slowness, terrified of its contents, more terrified of their implications. The letter was dated October 11th, 1985. The morning she'd left. My dearest Margaret. If you're reading this, it means you've finally come home. I knew you would, eventually. Perhaps not today, perhaps not for years or even decades, but I knew. You never were one to leave things truly unfinished, no matter how much you pretended otherwise. I'm writing this on the morning you're planning to leave. I can see it in everything you're not saying, the way you won't meet my eyes over breakfast, the way you keep checking your watch, the packed bag I found hidden in the truck bed. You think I don't notice these things, but Margaret, I've spent 27 years studying every detail of you. I notice everything. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you before I died, but I was too weak, too frightened, and then suddenly it was too late and you were holding my hand and I couldn't form the words anymore. The cabin isn't empty, Margaret. It never has been. There are things hidden here, crucial things, that you must find. Things about Rebecca. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. Rebecca. Their daughter. She had died 5 months before Vivian, killed in what the police called a hiking accident on Eagle Creek Trail. She was 22, fresh out of college, her whole brilliant life stretching ahead of her. The grief had consumed Vivian, hollowed her out from within until the cancer simply finished what heartbreak had begun. She blinked fiercely, forcing herself to continue reading. I know you've spent these years blaming yourself for Rebecca's death. I know you believed if you'd been more present, less focused on your dissertation, more attentive to the warnings, she wouldn't have been on that trail alone that morning. But Margaret, you were wrong. There's something about that accident you don't know. Something the sheriff's department never uncovered. Something I discovered 3 weeks before I died. I hid it in the cabin because I didn't know what else to do with it. I was too ill to fight, too exhausted to pursue justice, too frightened of the implications. But I couldn't let it vanish. So I created a trail. I left breadcrumbs for you to follow when you were finally strong enough, ready enough. Begin in the loft. Behind the loose floorboard near the chimney. You'll recognize which one. It's the board that always creaked when Rebecca would sneak up there at night to write in her journals by flashlight. I love you, Margaret. I loved you from the moment I saw you in that campus coffee shop with ink stains on your fingers. I loved you through every joy and every sorrow. I loved you even as you walked away. I love you still, wherever I am now. Find the truth. For Rebecca. For us. For yourself. Forever and always yours. Vivian. Margaret read the letter 4 times, each word carving deeper wounds into tissue that had never truly healed. Her hands shook so violently the paper rustled like autumn leaves in a gale. Rebecca. The accident. Something the sheriff never found. For 40 years, she'd believed her daughter's death was a tragic accident, a slippery trail after unexpected rain, a fatal fall from a cliff edge, devastating luck and worse timing. The official report had been definitive: accidental death, no suspicious circumstances, no evidence of foul play, likely lost her footing on wet rocks. But Vivian claimed there was more. Something concealed. Something important enough to preserve even as death approached. Margaret folded the letter with reverent care and slipped it into her jacket pocket, directly over her heart where she could feel its weight. Then she turned toward the narrow wooden ladder leading to the loft. The cabin's loft was barely tall enough for standing, a cramped triangular space beneath the pitched roof where Rebecca used to escape with her notebooks and dreams. She'd spent countless hours up there as a teenager and young adult, writing by lantern light, her shadow dancing across the ceiling below. Margaret climbed carefully, each rung protesting under her weight with sounds that echoed through decades. When her head cleared the loft floor, she paused, allowing her eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness. The space looked frozen in time. A thin mattress in one corner, long stripped of bedding. Cardboard boxes stacked against the eastern wall, their contents forgotten. And near the brick chimney that rose through the cabin's center, the floorboards showed their age, warped from moisture, weathered gray, some visibly loose. Margaret crawled forward on hands and knees, running her fingertips along the boards near the chimney base. Most were still firmly nailed, but one, the fourth board from the chimney, shifted slightly under pressure. This one. The one that always announced Rebecca's midnight writing sessions. She wedged her fingers into the narrow gap and pulled upward. The board lifted easily, as though someone had removed the nails long ago. Beneath it, in the dark cavity between supporting joists, something waited in the shadows. A wooden box. Small, approximately shoebox-sized, crafted from cedar with brass hinges tarnished by time. Margaret extracted it carefully, her heart pounding so ferociously she could feel the pulse in her temples, her throat, her fingertips. The box had a simple clasp but no lock. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, protected in clear plastic sleeves against moisture and decay, were documents. Photographs. Newspaper clippings. And on top of everything, a microcassette tape with a label in Vivian's distinctive handwriting, for Margaret. The truth about Rebecca's last day. Margaret sat back heavily, the box cradled in her lap like something sacred or dangerous or both, and for the first time in 40 years, she allowed herself to truly weep. Not the silent, swallowed grief she'd carried like stones in her pockets all this time, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame and echoed through the empty cabin like prayers or confessions. Because she understood now with devastating clarity. Vivian hadn't merely left her a letter. She'd left her a mission. A purpose. A reason to stop running from the past. A chance to finally confront the truth about the morning that had destroyed their family and scattered the survivors like ashes in wind. She pulled out the documents with unsteady hands. The first was a sheriff's report, not the official one she'd been shown 40 years ago, but a different document. A supplementary investigation filed 3 weeks after Rebecca's death and then mysteriously closed without explanation or follow-up. It mentioned a witness. Someone who'd seen Rebecca that morning on the trail, talking with another hiker. A man who'd seemed agitated, aggressive. The witness reported hearing raised voices, seeing Rebecca trying to back away. The witness's name was redacted with heavy black marker, but there was a handwritten note in the margin in Vivian's increasingly shaky script from her final weeks: Angela Reeves. Forest Service volunteer. She was terrified to testify. Said someone warned her to forget what she saw. Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Someone had warned the witness. Someone wanted the investigation closed. She dug deeper into the box with mounting dread. More documents emerged. A property survey map showing the trail area where Rebecca died. A land deed transfer dated 6 weeks after Rebecca's death, transferring a significant parcel of old-growth forest to a development corporation called Cascade Heights Properties. The name meant nothing to Margaret initially, but Vivian had underlined it repeatedly with aggressive strokes and written in the margin, Harrison Blackwood's company. He approached us twice wanting to buy timber rights to the land adjacent to our property. We refused both times. Rebecca had documented illegal logging. Then she died, and suddenly he got approval for his development after the investigation closed. Margaret's hands stilled completely, suspended in time. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture so dark she could barely force herself to look at it directly. Rebecca's death hadn't been an accident. Someone had confronted her on that trail. And that someone had benefited enormously from the silence that followed, benefited from the investigation closing, from the witness being silenced, from Margaret fleeing the area in grief-stricken devastation. She reached for the microcassette tape, but hesitated. She had no way to play it here in this powerless cabin. No tape player, no electricity, nothing but shadows and memories. She would need to return to town, find somewhere with the proper equipment. But as she began carefully repacking the box, something else caught her attention. A photograph, tucked in the very bottom beneath everything else. It showed Rebecca, perhaps 21 years old, standing on what appeared to be Eagle Creek Trail with a man Margaret didn't recognize. The man was older, maybe late 40s, wearing expensive hiking gear that looked pristine and out of place on someone supposedly experienced in the backcountry. His hand rested on Rebecca's shoulder in a way that made Margaret's stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. On the back of the photograph, in Rebecca's distinctive handwriting, HB says he wants to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding my environmental studies documentation. Meeting him on the trail Thursday morning. HB Harrison Blackwood. Margaret felt something cold and dark settle into her chest cavity like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of realization spreading outward. This man, this Harrison Blackwood, had known her daughter. Had arranged to meet her privately. Had wanted something from her regarding her environmental documentation. And then Rebecca had died on that trail, and suddenly Blackwood's development had received approval despite previous environmental objections. She carefully returned everything to the cedar box and descended the ladder with renewed purpose, moving faster now, urgency displacing the paralysis of grief and shock. In the main room, she set the box on the table beside Vivian's teacup and extracted her phone from her jacket pocket. No signal. Of course not, the cabin sat too deep in the mountains, too far from cell towers. She would need to drive back to the nearest town. But as she turned toward the door, something made her freeze. A sound. Faint but distinct. Coming from outside the cabin. Footsteps on the wooden porch. Margaret remained absolutely still. The footsteps stopped. Then came 3 deliberate knocks against the weathered door. Ms. Castellano? A woman's voice, unfamiliar and unexpected. I know you're in there. I saw your rental car parked down the access road. We need to talk. It's urgent. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. No one knew she was here. She'd told Daniel, but no one else. She'd driven straight from Portland, hadn't stopped in any nearby towns, hadn't spoken to anyone who might recognize her. Who are you? Margaret called out, her voice steadier than the trembling in her hands. A pause, heavy with significance. Then, my name is Sofia Navarro. I'm an investigative journalist with the Portland Tribune. I've been researching your daughter's death for 5 years. And I think someone knows you've returned. Someone who doesn't want you asking questions about what really happened on that trail. Margaret looked down at the cedar box on the table, at Vivian's letter pressed against her heart, at the photograph of Rebecca with Harrison Blackwood. And she understood with absolute, crystalline certainty that Vivian had been right about everything. The cabin wasn't empty. It never had been. It had been waiting for her to gather enough courage to return, waiting for buried truths to finally surface, waiting for justice that was 40 years overdue and desperately needed. She crossed to the door and placed her hand on the old brass handle, feeling the cold metal against her palm. Then she opened it. Margaret Castellano discovered her daughter Rebecca's death 40 years ago wasn't an accident, it was murder. Hidden documents, a silenced witness, and a powerful developer named Harrison Blackwood pointed to a cover-up. Now, investigative journalist Sofia Navarro stood at her door with information that would change everything. This is where the truth finally comes to light. Sofia Navarro was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps 35, with sharp dark eyes that missed nothing and the careful posture of someone accustomed to hostile receptions. She stood on the porch holding a weathered leather satchel, her gray Honda sedan visible through the trees where the access road curved. "May I come in?" Sofia asked, her voice respectful but urgent. "We don't have much time. If I found you this quickly, others will too." Margaret stepped aside, allowing the journalist to enter. Sofia's eyes immediately found the cedar box on the table, and something flickered across her face, recognition mixed with relief. "You found Vivian's evidence," Sofia said quietly. It wasn't a question. Margaret felt her defensive walls rising. "How do you know about my wife? About any of this?" Sofia set her satchel on the table beside the box. "Because 5 years ago, I was researching illegal logging operations in the Cascades for an environmental piece. I kept finding references to a young woman named Rebecca Castellano who'd been documenting violations before she died in what was ruled an accidental fall. The timing seemed convenient. Too convenient." She pulled a thick folder from her satchel and spread its contents across the table: photocopied documents, highlighted news articles, handwritten notes connecting names and dates with spiderweb lines. Harrison Blackwood's Cascade Heights Properties has been involved in 7 development projects over the past 40 years, Sofia continued, pointing to a timeline she'd constructed. In 5 of those 7 cases, environmental activists or witnesses who opposed the projects either died in accidents, disappeared, or suddenly dropped their opposition after receiving threats. Rebecca was the first. The pattern started with her. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. The sheriff's department investigated. They said there was no evidence of foul play. The sheriff's department closed the investigation after 3 weeks, Sofia corrected gently. Sheriff William Hartley, who happened to be Harrison Blackwood's brother-in-law. He retired 6 months after Rebecca's death and moved to a very expensive property in Southern California. Bought with cash. The implications hit Margaret like physical blows. The entire investigation had been corrupted from the beginning. Rebecca had never stood a chance at justice. "There's more," Sofia said, pulling out a small digital recorder. 2 years ago, I tracked down Angela Reeves, the Forest Service volunteer who witnessed Rebecca's final moments. She's in her 70s now, living in Idaho under a different name. She finally agreed to talk, but only after Blackwood died last year. She was terrified of him even decades later. Margaret's breath caught. "Blackwood is dead?" "Massive heart attack, 18 months ago. Once I confirmed he couldn't hurt her anymore, Angela agreed to tell me everything. I recorded it." Sofia held up the device. "Do you want to hear it?" Her son emerged looking worried and determined. "Mom, I'm sorry, but I couldn't let you do this alone. I called around, found out you were here, and..." He stopped, seeing Sofia and the boxes of evidence. "What's going on?" Margaret walked to her son and embraced him tightly. "I'm getting justice for your sister. Finally. After 40 years. She told him everything while Sofia continued packing. Daniel listened with growing horror and anger, his jaw tightening when he heard Angela Reeves' testimony, his eyes filling with tears when Margaret described Rebecca's final moments. "I want to help," Daniel said when she finished. "Whatever you need. I'm in this with you." "Then drive with us to Salem," Margaret said. "Bear witness. Help us tell Rebecca's story." The 3 of them locked the cabin for what Margaret knew would be the last time. The county would still demolish it, still sell the land, but that didn't matter anymore. The cabin had served its purpose. It had kept Vivian's evidence safe. It had called Margaret home when the time was finally right. It had been the vessel for truth that refused to stay buried. As they drove down the mountain toward Salem, Margaret called ahead to the Attorney General's office using Sofia's contacts. By the time they arrived at sunset, a special investigator was waiting for them, along with 2 assistant attorneys general and a stenographer. They spent 6 hours presenting the evidence, giving statements, playing recordings. Angela Reeves joined them via video conference from Idaho, her testimony official now, recorded and sworn. The attorneys' faces grew progressively grimmer as the full scope of the corruption became clear. "This is going to be a massive case," the lead investigator said near midnight. "Multiple jurisdictions, possible federal charges for some of the cover-up participants. It could take years." "I have years," Margaret said firmly. "I've already waited 40. I can wait however long justice requires." 3 weeks later, the Portland Tribune published Sofia Navarro's comprehensive investigation across 8 pages of their Sunday edition. The headline read, "The Rebecca Castellano Case, How a Daughter's Murder Was Buried by Money, Power, and Corruption." The story exploded across Oregon and then nationally. Harrison Blackwood couldn't be prosecuted, death had granted him that escape, but 7 people involved in the cover-up faced charges ranging from obstruction of justice to accessory after the fact. Sheriff William Hartley, living comfortably in California on what turned out to be bribe money, was arrested at his oceanfront home. 2 county officials who'd accepted payments to close investigations resigned in disgrace. A lawyer who'd threatened witnesses was disbarred and charged with witness tampering in multiple cases. The Cascade Heights Properties Corporation, now run by Blackwood's son, faced dozens of civil suits from families whose loved ones had been threatened or harmed. The company dissolved within 6 months, its assets liquidated to pay settlements. But more important than the legal consequences was what happened to Rebecca's memory. She was no longer just a tragic accident statistic. She was recognized as an environmental activist who died defending the forests she loved, murdered by a man who valued profit over human life. A scholarship was established in her name at Oregon State University for environmental science students. A section of Eagle Creek Trail was officially renamed the Rebecca Castellano Memorial Trail, with a plaque describing her courage and sacrifice. Margaret attended the trail dedication ceremony on a crisp October morning exactly 41 years after Rebecca's death. Daniel stood beside her, along with Sofia Navarro, Angela Reeves who'd flown out from Idaho, and nearly 200 people, environmentalists, former activists, families of other victims, people who'd read the story and wanted to honor Rebecca's memory. As Margaret placed flowers at the new memorial plaque, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 decades, peace. Not the absence of pain, that would never fully disappear, but the peace that comes from truth acknowledged, from justice pursued, from love remembered properly. That evening, Margaret returned to the cabin one final time before the demolition. She stood in the main room where Vivian's teacup still sat on the table, where the letter had waited 40 years to be found, where the truth had been preserved through love and determination. "We did it," Margaret said to the silence, to Vivian's spirit, to the memories held in these walls. "Rebecca's story is told. The truth is out. You were right about everything, my love." The cabin wasn't empty. It was full of purpose, waiting for the right moment. She picked up the teacup carefully, the only item she would take from this place. Everything else could be demolished, recycled, returned to the earth. But this small piece of porcelain with its painted flowers, would come home with her, a reminder that love endures, that truth persists, that justice delayed is not justice denied if someone has the courage to keep fighting. As Margaret locked the cabin door for the final time and walked toward her car where Daniel waited, she felt the weight she'd carried for 40 years finally lifting. The past couldn't be changed. Rebecca and Vivian couldn't be brought back. But their memories had been honored, their truth had been told, and the corruption that had stolen so much had finally been exposed and defeated. Margaret Castellano had returned to a deserted cabin after 40 years and found exactly what her wife had promised, not just evidence, not just truth, but purpose. The courage to stop running. The strength to face the past. And the determination to ensure that her daughter's death, her daughter's sacrifice, would mean something. As she drove away, watching the cabin disappear in her rearview mirror, Margaret whispered one final promise to the ghosts of her past. "I remember. The world remembers. And we will never forget."